Hello world, and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, Architect of Wonderlight, and today we're going to be starting a new series on executing a migration into Microsoft Azure. Hi guys, today we're going to be starting a new series on Azure App Migration. What we're going to be looking at over the next several weeks is how to execute a successful application migration into Azure. We're not going to be looking at it from a solitary application perspective, but looking at it more like you would look at an enterprise migration into Azure. So we're going to be talking about a lot of the aspects that go into planning and executing a migration into Azure. So today we're just going to start off with a basic introduction to the concepts that we're going to be looking at, and then we'll talk about some resources that you can use to help expedite that process and bring you up to speed on everything that is related to Azure App Migrations and everything that goes into planning an Azure App Migration. So any Azure App Migration starts with learning. So what you're going to be doing in an Azure App Migration is learning about Azure. You're going to be learning about the tools and technologies on Azure for getting your application from wherever it currently exists onto Azure. You want to learn about the hosting options of what do those look like on Azure. You want to learn about the best practices and strategies for hosting in the cloud. You also want to learn about the architectural patterns for how to host given kinds of applications on Azure. What are all of those things? What do they look like? How do I do them? And with the learning, you can get a baseline knowledge that you can then take into the next phase of an Azure App Migration, which is an assessment. Now, with an assessment, basically what you want to do is you want to take the knowledge that you've learned and map it onto whatever it is you're going to be migrating into Azure. So you want to look at your application, understand what does my application need to run? What does the data look like? Does it need file shares? What are the network connectivity standards that I'm implementing in my organization? What are the ways that people connect to this application? How do I expose this, if it's a public-facing application, to the internet? What are all of these kinds of things that go into making that application run? And you understand it through a discovery process, and you understand the business requirements as well, so that you understand things like BCDR for business continuity and disaster recovery, and what kind of uptime that you want to have and all the processes that go into making that application run. And then you take all of that discovery knowledge and you map it onto the things that are available in Azure. It's not just a technological mapping, it's also things like monitoring and architectural patterns and choosing the right resources and making sure that the governance is all there that maps onto whatever it is that your application is implementing for security. And you want to understand what Azure resources support whatever it is that I'm trying to accomplish in my application with that assessment. And that helps us get an architecture for a given application. So it'll be more of a logical architecture and maybe even somewhat physical whenever we start to map on resources to given things in an application. And we create that pattern, that architectural pattern based on best practices, and that serves as a blueprint for moving things into Azure. But that's not the end of the assessment. The next thing we need to do is take that assessment and that learning and create a plan from it. So the plan is going to encompass much more than just the application itself. It's going to give me some basic Azure governance before I even start a migration. So we're going to plan out our subscription management. We're going to plan out our roles and identity. We're going to be planning out an Azure landing zone, which is some basic infrastructure for on-premise connectivity or internet-based connectivity. We're going to plan out our Azure App Migrations and our data migrations. We're going to be planning out all of these things as part of this migration into Azure. And then we're going to set a schedule and we're going to set milestones so that we know what the success criterion are for a given phase of a migration. And that gives us the ability to project out how long is this going to take, what resources am I going to need, what can I expect from a interruption of business if I need to interrupt business, and many other things along those lines. So once I have that plan in play, then when I'm going to take that plan, I'm going to execute that plan. Now, the execution of the plan is basically just taking what I did in the plan and executing it in an orderly fashion. So the first thing we want to set up is security and governance in Azure. And that's basically setting up our subscriptions, setting up our role-based access controls and our identities and things like that. Then we stand up a Azure landing zone, which is basically some baseline infrastructure that gets us internet connectivity, access into Azure, and things like that. And then from there, I can then start doing app migrations into Azure. Now, what I've typically experienced with many application migrations is folks want to jump to number 3 without doing 1 and 2 first. And what they end up doing inevitably is they end up creating a lot of resources in Azure with no idea with what those resources are for and why they're in Azure, and they're afraid to turn it off because they're afraid that something might break, and ended up running up their Azure spend with no idea with what actually is going on in their Azure environment. So if you do security and governance first, and then you set up your Azure landing zone and then do your app migrations, you'll have a lot better control over what's going on in your Azure environment. You'll know why things are stood up, where they're residing, who stood them up, and you'll be able to understand your Azure spend a lot better, and you'll be able to control all of that much better if you do 1 and 2 before you jump to 3, which is oftentimes the temptation for many folks moving into Azure. So executing that plan is absolutely critical to making sure that you do it successfully, so that you don't come back in 6 months after you've gone to Azure and you're saying, well, why is Azure so expensive? What's going on? Usually in my experience is because the first 2 weren't done well and they end up with a mess. And that is why they call me in to kind of say, okay, how do we come back and do step 1 and 2, even though we've done step 3 already? And sometimes that's a lot harder to do after the fact than it is before the fact. But once you do your execution, then you always want to create a feedback loop so that you're always improving and planning your Azure app migration. So there'll be changes that you might need to tweak along the way. There might be some new feature that you're adding to your software. Maybe it's a software upgrade. You're doing another app migration after you do your initial 2 or 3 applications, and you want to do this process all over again. So you do another assessment, you plan an execution, and then you execute that. And you create that constant feedback loop, just like you would have in an on-premise environment where you're doing a lot of that app migration into Azure, you're doing new applications into your on-premise environment. You want to have a feedback loop so that you're actually able to control the change, monitor the change, and then execute the change according to a plan. So today, we're not going to be looking at all of this because this is going to be multiple weeks where we're going to be talking about each one of these various phases in an Azure app migration, but we're primarily going to be looking at this top left quadrant up here where we're going to be talking about learning. And we're going to be talking about what is it that you need to learn before you go to Azure. So let's go over to that and take a look at what we need to learn, and then we'll walk through a couple of slides where I'm going to detail the things that are very critical to know before moving into Azure, and then I'll point you to some resources that you can use that will help you shore up your knowledge if you're lacking in that area. So when we talk about learning Azure, we're going to be talking about learning the basic infrastructure on Azure. So the first thing that most people start off with is Azure Infrastructure as a Service. And this is a very familiar concept because most people are coming from an environment where they have infrastructure, and these ideas and concepts map onto that usually. So we're talking about things like virtual machines and networks and connectivities using things like VPNs or express routes, which are kind of like MPLS connections, private endpoints, which are like endpoints for services on Azure, and peering between various networks, which are basically just connecting 2 networks together, and things like Azure Front Door, which are global entry points for an Azure environment. And then, of course, there's network security, which are very familiar concepts to most folks. We're talking about network security groups, which are a basic port filter for Azure. There's Azure Firewall, which is a more context-aware firewall that does a lot of stateful packet inspections as well as security assessment. Application security groups, which are kind of a way to group things together for NSGs. Web application firewalls, Bastion hosts, the point-to-site VPNs, and Windows Virtual Desktop if you're wanting to deploy something like virtual desktop for clients to connect to and access applications using Windows Virtual Desktop and things like that. And of course, there are things like Global Presence, which is useful for applications that have global scale that need to span the globe. So we're going to be talking about things like CDNs, Traffic Manager, which is a DNS-based load balancer, and Azure Front Door, which I mentioned up here, which is a connectivity, a global point of presence for applications and for VPNs and other things like that to connect into Azure through an Azure endpoint somewhere that is geographically close, and they can get on the Azure backbone and access a global scale application over Azure's network versus traversing the public internet through front door. And there's also things you can do with security and other things like that with that app, with that particular product. So these are very familiar concepts to a lot of folks, but these are some of the things that you need to become aware of and just understand, so that whenever you go to Azure, you might be thinking about using Azure virtual machines and infrastructure as a service. Inevitably, though, with most application migrations into Azure, there's going to be some aspect of infrastructure as a service, and usually it's not either infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. Usually it's a mixture of the two, and you're going to have a couple of these things in play, usually if you're going to be doing something like an enterprise migration into Azure, because you're almost inevitably going to be dealing with something like a VPN or an express route, and you're going to have things like security that you need to contend with and a lot of other things. So these concepts are important, even if you're not going to be using virtual machines, to understand what these are and what they do. So the next thing that folks need to learn about on Azure is platform as a service. Now, platform as a service is one of the value propositions of moving to the cloud, because with platform as a service, you're no longer in the business of maintaining infrastructure. So you delegate that responsibility to the cloud service provider, and you simply just run your applications on top of that. And there are a lot of advantages of that, but it comes with a more opinionated environment. However, the offerings on Azure are pretty open to hosting all kinds of different applications. We're going to do a detailed list of this, and right here what we see on this slide. So for databases, we have things like Azure SQL, Azure SQL proper, which would be a basically an instance of SQL Server on Azure with some of the functionality that's not available in Azure SQL, but you have a lot of options there, from enterprise scale to very small databases for like dev test environments, and a lot of middle ground there as well in Azure SQL. You have Azure Managed Instances, which are a little bit closer to a Azure SQL server in Azure. It's a managed resource, but it's got more functionality that comes with SQL Server that isn't available in an Azure SQL instance. And then, of course, you have the open source databases like Postgre or MySQL or MariaDB, which are provided as a service with a lot of options and tiers available there as well. And then you have Cosmos DB, which Cosmos DB is a document database that has a lot of different paradigms that is typically used for things like Mongo or a graph database, or many of these other kinds of database options that are available on Azure through Cosmos. And then these right here are a couple of hosting options on Azure. Azure App Services basically is a place to host websites, so web applications could be hosted here. And this is where you can install .NET applications on a Windows host. You can also do Node.js or Python or PHP applications, and these will run on Linux or Windows. And so you have some options there for running applications that are more web-oriented in Azure App Services there. And then it also has some native functionality built around Azure Functions, which are a way to write applications using the serverless paradigm. And so this is where you can go greenfield if you so choose, or you might want to change pieces of your existing application through some refactoring to take advantage of functions if you have parts of your application that can do that, rather than just a straight lift and shift onto Azure App Services. Then, of course, there's containers, which are Docker containers, which are well supported on Azure. You have the ability to run Azure Kubernetes services, which is still on an infrastructure, but it's more what I might call managed infrastructure. And so you're not going to be responsible for doing a lot of the maintenance on that infrastructure, but it's still exposed to you. So you'll be aware of that infrastructure whenever you deploy containers, Kubernetes to Azure using AKS. You also run Azure Container Instances, and it's something I don't have on the slide, but you can also use containers with Azure App Services as well. But these container instances are basically small-scale container deployments that you can use to create a container on Azure, run it for a little while, shut it down. But if you need to run containers in a manner that isn't large-scale, which you might get with Kubernetes, but you need them to be long-running, then Azure App Services would be a way to do that as well. And of course, with containers, you need a container registry. And then here's some integration platforms that you might want to consider for data. Logic apps are a way to create workflows on Azure, which are visual workflows that you can have a designer and then connect pieces together through connectors, and then you can apply some basic business logic to those, manipulate the things, and then have output bindings so that you can take the transformations that you do in your logic app and write it out to something like a database or a file share or a blob storage account, whatever it might be. And of course, there are things like Data Factory, which is a platform as a service ETL tool. And of course, Databricks is kind of its big brother, where you have a lot more control over the code. This was more of a this is more of a visual designer that gives you the ability to build visual workflows. And this is going to give you a lot more ability to code things up. And it's going to get you a little bit closer to the metal for building ETL workloads and do extract, transform, and load. And that would go along with big data workloads as well related to Azure SQL. And of course, there is messaging platforms. You have things like Azure Message Bus, Event Hub, and Event Grid, which are different messaging platforms for different paradigms. And we'll be looking at those in future videos, where we're talking about more app migrations if you have to take advantage of these various messaging platforms. But for the most part, most folks are probably going to be using something like Message Bus, which is going to be the traditional queues and topics. And it's got a support for a number of different protocols, which are well supported by applications as well. So that's a quick overview of platform as a service. And there's a couple of things I didn't even mention here, but understanding platform as a service is important, especially the data offerings and the app services and the container offerings on Azure is really going to be useful for doing an evaluation of your on-premise environments and then figuring out how you want to host that on Azure. And of course, we're going to be getting into this in a lot more detail in future videos. So no Azure learning experience would be complete without talking about security. It's one of the more important topics that you can learn on Azure. And there's several resources that we can talk about here. Of course, there's Key Vault, which is secrets management. It's a place to store things like certificates, passwords, keys, and that kind of thing on a hardware security module that you have access to. And many of the other features that we have talked about integrate well with Key Vault. Then there's also Security Center, which is a single pane of glass that integrates a lot of the other security features on Azure, such as logging and monitoring and threat detection, as well as Azure policy and other things related to governance into a single pane of glass so you can more easily manage that. Azure Sentinel is Azure's SIEM tool. It's used for those kinds of threats that aren't signature based. So this would be anomalies in patterns that are detected by things in your logs. So basically you connect a Sentinel to your logs, and then it will monitor your logs and look for patterns in those logs, and it will alert you if it detects an anomaly in those logs and other kinds of metrics that you might have inside of what is coming out of Azure. And that connects up to Azure Monitor and Log Analytics, which are part of Sentinel. So the next thing that we can talk about is Azure Advisor. It's basically a free tool that gives you best practices and security recommendations for free on Azure, and it also does things like help you optimize your costs in Azure. So Azure Advisor is a very good, useful tool for a number of different things, but especially around security. If you don't want to pay for Security Center, the premium version, you can you can get a lot of free advice on Azure Advisor without having to pay a dime. Then you also have Azure AD, which is, of course, the first-party offering for Azure for role-based access control. Now, Azure AD itself is what you're going to be using anyway on Azure to set up subscriptions and also set up identities on your Azure subscription. Now, you can have the authentication piece delegated to some other service if you so choose, if you don't want to use Azure for authentication. But you will have to use Azure AD for all the role-based access controls in the Azure environment. Now, you can use something else for your application, but if you're going to be setting up RBAC on Azure, you'll need to use Azure AD, so it's going to be integrated with that. And it does a lot of other things like app registrations for doing things like OAuth and identity management that way, syncing and federation with other types of identity stores, entitlements management, and then also multi-factor authentication. You want to turn that on and connect things like an authenticator application, or use text messages for multi-factor authentication on Azure. You can do that as well. Now, Azure AD B2C is Azure AD, but this is more a business to consumer oriented product and allows you to customize a login experience for your particular applications that you might be running. And it gives you the ability to integrate with a lot of social logins as well, like Facebook and Twitter and Microsoft accounts and many other types of identity management solutions into a single place, and then it makes managing that more simple for your application, so you don't have to connect your application up to 1,000 different identity providers. You can use Azure B2C to provide that experience, and then Azure B2C then can manage your applications much more simply as well. This is useful for those kinds of things that you're not integrating with other business partners, but you just want to have a standard offering for your customers to log into your applications using whatever social logins they might want to use, or they can register their own self within the context of Azure B2C just by signing up and then verifying an email or something like that. And of course, you have network security groups, network security, which is a big deal on Azure. You have a lot of different products that we've already mentioned. You have NSGs, which are basically port filters, Azure Firewall, application security groups, web application firewalls, Bastion hosts, which are basically Bastion hosts is a way to connect into a VNet by way of an internet browser without having to use RDP or an SSH session. Then you have point-to-site VPNs, and of course, Windows Virtual Desktops if you don't want to be creating a bunch of VMs and managing those on Azure. You can use Windows Virtual Desktop just to provide a desktop experience as a service on Azure as well and have a very secure environment that way. So again, lots of things to talk about here. We've done an entire series on this, and then of course there's some excellent resources available on YouTube and other platforms for learning Azure security. And this is one of those things that if you're not going to be an expert in it, you at least need to be familiar with it so that you understand what all these various offerings do, because they'll have big implications on your Azure experience as a whole and how you deploy your applications into Azure. So riding the coattails of security, of course, is monitoring. Monitoring really does deserve its own slide because it's more than just security. Monitoring plays into security, governance, and optimization on Azure. So having the right tools in play will give you a lot more awareness of what's going on in your Azure environment. Now, of course, the main tool for doing this is Azure Monitor. It's a general purpose tool that gives you a suite of tools for doing things on Azure. So it basically gives you the ability to aggregate a bunch of logs together and metrics into essentially a database, and gives you the ability to do log analytics against that, to do alerting against that, to proactively respond to things in your environment that aren't necessarily security related. It might be things like scaling that you need to do. It gives you a lot of abilities like that are built into the Azure Monitor package, and it's just a Swiss Army knife like tool for doing all kinds of different things related to monitoring. Now, Azure Sentinel is built on top of Azure Monitor. It's a real-time security, and we've already talked about that when we talked about security, but it's also useful for monitoring Azure as well. Now, log analytics is the foundation for both Azure Monitor and Azure Sentinel, and is basically the place where you do log aggregation that Azure Monitor and Azure Sentinel use, and you can use that as a way to do research into problems, and you can use it for aggregations as well as being able to drill down into logs and correlate data and a number of other things related to analyzing and getting information out of logs that are coming from a variety of different sources across Azure and even across various environments that might not be on Azure. Log Analytics has a lot of ways to do that. Now, App Insights is a point solution built on top of Azure Monitor and Log Analytics that's specifically designed for app instrumentation. So with this, what you have is code level analysis going on inside of something like Azure App Services or a container that's actually proactively monitoring your application. And then it's taking all of the data out of that, taking all that telemetry and putting it into Azure Log Analytics, and it gives you a custom solution for that. So you're going to be able to get things like exception handling and errors and other kinds of information about what's going on inside of your application at the code level so that you can diagnose problems and then figure out how your application is behaving in a production environment. So that's a very useful tool for anything running on Azure. It doesn't have to be Azure Apps Insight, Azure App Services, but it's very easy to turn on whenever you're using Azure App Insights, and it's got native integration for .NET as well as Java applications that are running inside of that environment. But you can use it for other languages as well, even though it might not be able to get into the weeds as much because the instrumentation is more tuned for things like .NET and .NET Core. Now, Azure Automation is another tool that works with Azure Monitor and Azure Sentinel. And it gives you the ability to respond to things using playbooks, essentially scripts for running things on Azure so that you can do things in a proactive manner when an event occurs. So maybe that's scaling up VMs or scaling down VMs. Maybe it's turning off VMs at a particular time of day or booting VMs up at another particular time of day. Maybe it's increasing the capacity of the compute capacity of a database or scaling that down whenever you're going off hours. Things like that. It's basically a suite of tools for building automated processes that can be invoked manually or by things that happen in your Azure environment based on the monitoring solutions that you have in play. Security and monitoring and governance kind of all go together in a lot of ways because they do play on one another in a lot of different ways. Now, governance on Azure is a multifaceted conversation, and a lot of it's going to be driven by the business processes and the business patterns that you have in play in your organization. But I'm going to talk about the tools that you would use for implementing that here on Azure. Now, with Azure, you can stand up what we call management groups, and these are basically a way to manage Azure subscriptions using an enterprise agreement on Azure. So you can stand up dozens or hundreds or thousands of Azure subscriptions using management groups in a hierarchical way. And then you can apply policies and procedures and controls around Azure subscriptions using management groups. And that's a particularly useful tool for enterprises that are moving into Azure rather than just a small business or medium business, but you need a way to scale up across multiple subscriptions and be able to control that. Well, management groups would be the way to do that. Of course, RBAC is going to be a critical feature of that. Of course, that relates to security, but it also relates to governance as well. So you need to establish what the roles that you're going to be using are, and then set up access controls around those roles as well. Now, policy is a way to enforce business rules on Azure. Where RBAC controls access into Azure, there are certain things that RBAC is not going to accomplish for you. So you can use Azure policy to amend that with custom rules or some of the out-of-the-box rules to enforce business rules on Azure. And this can be useful for things like ensuring that all of your virtual machines are within a particular set of SKUs that are acceptable for your particular applications, or making sure that your Azure subscriptions or your Azure resources are all within a given set of regions rather than be able to deploy outside of a given geography. You can enforce that. You can do things like ensure that all of your Azure resources are tagged appropriately so that you can build automation around tagging. Policy gives you a lot of things related to that, and it can also be used to audit things as well. So it's a very useful tool for doing all things governance that aren't related to RBAC inside of Azure. Now, tagging is a way to organize resources that doesn't fall into the management group subscription resource group hierarchy that you see in Azure. So with tags, you can create a bunch of different kinds of tags that relate to business functionality or to operational functionality. And then you can build processes and analysis around those tags. And then you can use policy, Azure policy, to enforce the appropriate tagging on your resources on Azure. Now, ARM templates are a way to automate infrastructure as code on Azure. Now, this is important for DevOps processes, and that is going to be something we're going to be talking about in future videos when we get into a lot more around processes and governance. But ARM templates are a way to basically stand up resources and then on Azure and be able to deploy those automatically. But if you can do it through automation, basically it gives you the ability to stamp out new environments, run tests, create chaos in your environment, do all of those kinds of things using ARM templates. And then when you're done doing those kinds of tests, you can tear it down very quickly without having to create all that stuff manually, which can be very burdensome. So ARM templates are a way to create resources automatically, spin them up, and tear them down. And that's good for development as well as testing inside of your environment. Azure Blueprints is kind of a beta-ish type product, and it attempts to take ARM policy and combine it, ARM templates, and combine them with policy to create secure, compliant environments across your organization. Because policy, in addition to many of the other features I mentioned, it also gives you the ability to do policy, do compliance auditing in your environment based on best practices prescribed by the Azure security team, or external things like a HIPAA or other types of compliance that might be related to your organization. So with Blueprint, it gives you the ability to combine those two to create secure environments out of the gate. Now, Blueprint is still kind of in beta, but and it's evolving. But you don't have to use it, but you can combine ARM and policy together in order to get a more complete offering just by deploying blueprints in that respect. And then, of course, no governance conversation would be complete without cost management. It's actually a platform on Azure that integrates well with tagging, as well as management groups, which would be around subscriptions and resource groups in Azure. So you can basically use cost management to get an idea of what's going on inside your Azure environment, and you can see how things are being used and where spend is happening and who's responsible for that spend. And if you're using bill back, you can create reports and all of that kind of stuff. You can create budgets. There's a lot of features built into cost management that are very useful for managing costs on Azure. So folks that do tagging well and management and creating all that resource management well and creating RBAC policies and all of that typically have a very good view of what's going on in their environment from a cost perspective. And so doing all that upfront analysis in your environment helps create this governance package that you're going to be deploying into Azure whenever you go to that particular migration. So again, and something to learn, this is often one of the most overlooked things on Azure, but done right out of the gate, it will give you a lot more control over your Azure environment, and you'll have a lot more awareness of what's going on in your environment. So no conversation in Azure migration would be complete without a process discussion, because this is one of the most important topics when it comes to change management in Azure. So process management is typically associated with DevOps, and if you're not doing a process management or DevOps process when you're moving into Azure, it's a good time to establish one, because it will help you manage your Azure environment all the more because of things like infrastructure as code and all the other kind of change management tools and monitoring tools that are available in Azure that can help inform your process. So we can't tell you a lot about learning a process. Now, of course, there are a lot of processes available for doing change management, and there's a lot of things that you would need to talk about within that context, but the tools that are available on Azure are typically going to be related to managing artifacts and then managing the process itself. So you're going to be looking at things like Azure, and from the perspective of Azure DevOps, maybe, or maybe using GitHub to manage artifacts. That would be things like managing ARM templates and Azure policies and other types of artifacts like that you want to deploy into Azure using automation, and then using the DevOps tools to handle the deployment of those is going to be a very important process of that, as well as changing those so that you can have a full history of changes and who changed it, who deployed it, and when they deployed it, and that kind of thing. And then, of course, the pipelines that go along with artifact management, that's for automating those things, those changes into Azure. Now, that can be changes to the Azure environment itself, or it can be for your applications going into Azure. So code changes, upgrades, database changes, things like that. That's where pipeline and processes are going to be happening. And in those pipelines and processes, you want to be able to establish things like testing and having a test regimen that you apply to things. And you can stand up different environments for like things like UAT for testing, or for dev test environments. You can stand those up as well. You can also spin up your production environments using some of the same code that you would otherwise use for those test environments as well. And of course, you want to be able to use boards for project management. And boards would be things like for task management. And what you can do with a lot of things, a lot of boards, is attach those to particular assets and particular pipeline builds and things like that, so that you can associate a task with a particular deployment or upgrade or change into your environment. So it gives you the ability to manage all that. And of course, wikis for documentation, so that you can document your process. You can document your policies and things like that go into making your environment run. So having a well-maintained document repository is important to any environment, so that folks can find information about best practices in your environment, strategies, deployments, and all that. So all of these things go into managing that process, and typically it's going to be called DevOps. Now, different folks call it different things, but this is typically the tooling that you use. But however you manage that process, it could be a number of different ways, but the tooling available to Azure is there with Azure DevOps, or you can adopt other tooling. It doesn't have to be Azure DevOps. So we've talked about all the things that you might want to learn when moving into an Azure environment, and it's important to understand kind of all of those various things on Azure, because those things are going to be helpful in migrating applications to Azure. These are some trainings that Microsoft offers for that. One of the trainings I would recommend that just anybody take and could benefit if they're considering moving to Azure, whether you're just an engineer or an executive, it doesn't really matter, is to take the AZ900. It's just a soup to nuts Azure 101 type experience where you can get some basic knowledge about Azure. It's usually a 1 or 2 day training where you'll get exposure to all of the various things that we've talked about in the course of this slide, and you'll get some basic information about all of those different offerings, and it will get you at least some knowledge about how they all work and how they all work together. But if you want to get into one of the specializations for Azure, of course, you can do Azure Administrator and Azure Administration, and that's going to talk about kind of the operational side of Azure. That's going to get into things like Azure VMs, VNets, all of the infrastructure pieces, as well as some of the platform as a service offerings. It's going to be, and the monitoring solutions. It's going to talk about more the operational side of Azure. And if you're going to be writing applications or moving applications into Azure, understanding Azure Developer, under Azure as a developer, using Azure Developer Certification is a good one to have. It will get you exposure to the app services platform, to the database platforms, as well as some of the messaging platforms that are available. And you'll learn about the patterns and principles that are related to running an application successfully on Azure. Now, if you want to go a step further and get some more in-depth training, Azure Architecture is a good set of certificates to have. Now, Azure Architecture is going to be 2 certs, and it's basically going to get you broader exposure to all things on Azure, but it's going to go a little bit more in depth than what you get with an Azure Fundamentals course. And it's also going to expect you to be able to kind of see that synoptically, so that you can piece things together to come up with architectures for deploying applications into Azure. So usually that one comes as a set of 2 exams that you can get, and combine those, and you'll get a certification as a certified Azure architect. And these last 2 are specialties. Azure AZ400 is around DevOps. That's going to be more process. Of course, the tooling around this is not Azure DevOps certification. It's not going to look at so much Azure DevOps, the product, but Azure DevOps from the conceptual side. It's going to look at things like automation and process. It's going to make sure you understand Agile. It's going to make sure that you understand infrastructure as code and how to build pipelines and do deployments into Azure and things like that, so that you can understand that side of the game. And then there is security, and this is going to talk about all those security tools that we mentioned, and it's going to give you a baseline of what you're going to be looking for from the security perspective for standing up things like Sentinel, Azure Security Center, network security groups, and web application firewall, Azure Firewall, VPNs, and all the kind of infrastructure, as well as the RBAC side of things and the governance side of things as well. And so this is a good one to get into if you're thinking about Azure governance and you're thinking about Azure security as well. So I personally have done all of these, and because I live and breathe Azure, I've gone through the process of learning Azure administration as a developer, as an architect, through DevOps, as well as Azure security. So I have I have done all these certifications and gone through the course material, and have tried to understand Azure soup to nuts, because that's what I do for a living every day. But learning these Azure certifications in your particular domain, combined with something like the Azure Fundamentals, would be probably good enough for folks that are going to be working in Azure. But if you want to get more in depth and understand Azure synoptically, and you can get the Azure 300 certification, AZ300, and then maybe even shore that up with some of these other ones that aren't specializations in Azure. So again, these are certifications certifications from Azure, go out there, get them. They're usually not too much. You can get them, study for them, and you'll learn a lot about Azure, and you'll get a certification when you're done. In addition to the training recommendations, I want to point you to 2 document repositories that are going to help you learn about Azure. And the first one is the Cloud Adoption Framework. The Cloud Adoption Framework is a set of documents that are basically going to give you a set of best practices and processes and things that you can implement on Azure. Now, this is going to be more oriented around moving into Azure without any particular application in mind. So this is going to be about setting up things like subscriptions and RBAC and policy and monitoring and a lot of things that go into establishing governance and controls in your Azure environment. And the Cloud Adoption Framework is designed to help you understand and implement those kinds of things using the best practices that Microsoft has developed and experienced through the years of running Azure. Now, the second document repository I want to talk about is the well-architected framework. Now, this one complements the Cloud Adoption Framework. The Cloud Adoption Framework, again, is more oriented around a general migration into Azure, into the cloud. The well-architected framework is going to get into the details of specific kinds of workloads on Azure. So that's going to be application-specific type things. So if you need to move an application that is maybe a PHP-based application running on MySQL into Azure, well, the well-architected framework is going to give you best practices and guidance on how to move an application into Azure. And it's got a lot of different patterns related to various things about how to stand up databases and how to stand up architecture and security around those databases and getting your application working well with that. And it's going to give you discussions and diagrams that you can look at and use those as kind of a starting place for your application specific needs. So the well-architected framework works with the Cloud Adoption Framework to give you a more holistic set of documentation that's going to help you get your applications up and running in Azure. Thanks for bearing with me over the course of this video. I know it's been a pretty long one, but there's a lot of things to learn about on Azure. Now, as a practitioner on Azure, you don't necessarily have to get detailed knowledge of everything on Azure. You probably just need to skill up in your particular domain and then have a general knowledge of how the rest of Azure works. So if you're a security architect or security engineer, learn everything related to security, but generally have an idea of how everything else on Azure works together so that you can do that learning phase. And then once you learn things, you can then do the next phase, which is an assessment. And I'm going to be showing you how to do an assessment over the next few weeks, where we're going to be looking at how to do an assessment on apps and infrastructure security governance, business process, and we're going to be looking at all these things in detail. And I'm going to show you some tooling that's available for that. And then we'll be looking at the well-architected framework as well as the Cloud Adoption Framework and how you can use those to help build an architecture. And then that will then inform the next step, which is planning. So we're going to be looking at that over the next few weeks, and I'm looking forward to doing these videos to help you execute a successful migration into Azure.
If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintelect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintelect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintelect on Twitter at WintelectNow or at Wintelect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintelect.com. Until next time, thank you.